In the old westerns, the cowboy rides in as the hero, and indigenous people get cast as the savages. Was it really that simple? That's the Hollywood version. The real story isn't a clean morality play. It runs more like a machine. A system of hunger, greed, and survival. Gears that pushed people out of Europe, pulled them across the Atlantic, and then ground everyone into a violent collision.
And let's be clear about who those Europeans were. They weren't all wealthy adventurers or conquering elites. A lot of them were desperate. The Library of Congress notes that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the European population in colonial-era America arrived as indentured servants, apprentices, or transported convicts.
Exactly. So it's not just they came for freedom. For many, their labour was the price of passage, and it could be bought, sold, and controlled. So today we're taking apart the mechanics. First, the push. What pressures in Europe made leaving feel like the only option? Then, the contact. Inside that collision, there's a period when Europeans and indigenous nations sometimes cooperated, traded, and negotiated.
Historians call that the middle ground. In places like the Great Lakes region, Europeans were often too weak to dictate terms, so they negotiated to survive.
But that balance didn't last. Finally, the power shift. How mass migration and expanding state power tipped the scale from negotiation to domination. And it's not just armies and numbers, it's words. Labels like savage and civilized were used to frame dispossession as lawful, even inevitable.
When we ask, why did Europeans, especially English men, go there? We tend to picture one stock character, the fearless explorer or the cold-blooded conqueror. But the truth looks more like this dock behind me, crowded, tense, and mixed. We're talking about multiple Europes. Yes, landlords and merchants, but also debtors, displaced rural families, religious dissenters, and younger sons with a last name and no future.
So the user's idea that they failed in Europe actually holds water.
It does, if we're precise. Failure wasn't just personal weakness. For a lot of people, it meant the rules in the economy back home were squeezing them out.
Exactly. And one of the biggest engines of that squeeze was enclosure. For centuries, villagers relied on common land for grazing, gathering fuel, growing food. And then, over time, those shared rights were converted into private property. Between 1604 and 1914, Parliament passed more than 5,200 enclosure acts. This kind of map on screen is a later snapshot of how officially the countryside got carved up.
Think of it as privatization with fences, hedges, walls, boundaries, new lines that turned everyone's resource into someone's asset.
Efficient sounds good, doesn't it?
For owners, sure, productivity often rose, but the social cost was brutal. If you lived off common rights, that new stone wall in the image isn't just a fence, it's a lock.
And once the lock clicks shut, people move. Some crowded into towns looking for wage work. Others looked across the Atlantic and thought, if there's no place for me here, maybe there's a place for me there.
Okay, so that explains the poor. But what about the fancy guys, the ones leading the colonies?
That brings us to primogeniture, a simple rule with a sharp edge. Watch the diagram. One estate, one heir. In many landed families, the eldest son inherited the core of the property. Younger sons could end up with education and expectations, but not the land that made those expectations realistic.
So you get surplus elites, people with status training, ambition and connections, looking for somewhere they can turn that into acreage and authority.
So we have the desperate poor and the restless rich. What about the religious folks, the pilgrims?
That's the third push, conscience versus the state. Picture the scene on screen, quiet worship, and then the knock at the door. Take the Quakers. In the movement's early decades, about 15,000 were imprisoned in Britain, and roughly 450 died in prison. And in France, after the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes, more than 200,000 Huguenots fled persecution across borders.
For them, America wasn't just opportunity, it was refuge.
It paints a pretty bleak picture. It sounds like a lot of these people were refugees.
Many were, and desperation has a price. One of the defining arrangements of early English America wasn't a dream, it was a contract. They sold years of their labor.
This is the part Hollywood skips. Across the 1600s into the 1700s, a huge share of European arrivals came bound by indenture, especially in the early plantation colonies.
In the Chesapeake in the 1600s, historians estimate indentured servants made up something like 70 to 85% of English migrants. Typical terms ran 4 to 7 years, long enough to survive the crossing and long enough to be owned by the job.
They weren't mythic, free pioneers. They were labor in a system built to extract. And when you mix hunger, contracts, and expansion, that pressure doesn't stay contained. It rolls outward onto indigenous nations.
Picture the Great Lakes region on the map. The French called this vast interior the Pays d'en haut, the upper country. And here's the myth we have to unlearn, that contact meant constant, total war.
Wait, isn't that the standard story? Settlers arrive, fighting starts, and it never stops until the frontier closes.
There were wars, raids, and real brutality. Absolutely. But for long stretches in the Great Lakes, neither side could simply dominate the other. Power was divided, and that forced negotiation.
Not because they were friends, because the Europeans were weak. Take Detroit in 1701. Cadillac shows up with about 100 settlers and soldiers to build Fort Pontchartrain. Around them, indigenous communities could gather thousands of people and hundreds of warriors. You don't conquer in that situation. You bargain, or you're gone.
Exactly. Historian Richard White calls this world the middle ground, roughly 1650 to 1815, when mutual need forced both sides to translate, improvise, and compromise.
So if they weren't fighting, what were they doing?
They were building a shared world through negotiation. Trade, marriage ties, adoption, alliance councils, new rituals. Look at the shoreline scene on screen. Goods, people, and talk first, because relationship is the infrastructure.
And the engine of all this was the fur trade. This wasn't just local barter. It was a global supply chain. Furs from the interior, across the Great Lakes and beyond, moved through Montreal to Atlantic markets like London. In return came muskets, metal tools, cloth, and ammunition, flowing back into the interior.
That kind of commerce needs predictability, and predictability takes peace. Look at the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. Roughly 1,300 indigenous delegates representing 39 nations gather to formalize a treaty with New France. And those pictographs on the document are signatures, not decoration.
1,300. That sounds like a United Nations summit.
Closer to that than to a campfire myth. Protocols, speeches, kinship language, and high-stakes international politics.
But let's be clear about the terms. They didn't live in just one format.
Right. Paper for Europeans and wampum for indigenous diplomacy, where beads could record and authorize commitments.
And those agreements often came with conditions, not surrender.
So why did it stop? Why do we remember the wars and not the wampum?
Because the middle ground only exists when neither side can dictate terms. When the balance tips, the in-between disappears.
After 1763, after Britain defeats France in the 7 Years' War, British officials inherit these alliances. General Amherst, in particular, treats gift-giving as waste and tightens the flow of powder and shot.
So people who'd been treated like allies are suddenly handled like subjects. Cutting back gifts and ammunition lands as a message: you're conquered.
And the result is Pontiac's War in 1763 to 64, fighting that sweeps across British posts in the Great Lakes. The point isn't that negotiation vanishes overnight. It's that the rules of diplomacy are being broken.
So the violence surges when the diplomacy breaks.
Precisely. And as settler populations grow and forts multiply, as the scale tips on screen, coercion becomes cheaper than compromise. The middle ground cracks when one side no longer has to translate.
That's the tragedy. Not ancient hatreds, changing leverage. Who needs whom, and who can refuse?
And once that balance tips, the legal machinery we talked about earlier, the savage construct, can be weaponized at full force.
We need to talk about the word savage. It wasn't just an insult, it became a legal tool, one that turns people into paperwork.
You mean like a justification for violence?
I mean a justification for taking land. If you can frame a nation as not fully sovereign in the way Europeans recognized, you can treat their laws as invisible and their property as something they only occupy, not truly own.
This is the history gets dark. That framing shows up right in early U.S. political language.
Exactly. In the Declaration of Independence, there's a grievance that calls indigenous people merciless Indian savages. I'm quoting it historically, not endorsing it. The point was to paint indigenous nations as chaos, not as political communities with claims and diplomacy.
So it's propaganda. But did it actually hold up in court?
It did. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. It's one of the foundational cases for how U.S. law talks about land title. Chief Justice John Marshall describes tribes as fierce savages and says leaving them in possession of their country would leave it a wilderness. That language isn't a side note. It's doing legal work.
This is the U.S. version of the doctrine of discovery. Discovery gives the sovereign the underlying title, and indigenous nations are left with a limited right of occupancy, a right the government claims it can extinguish.
That sounds a lot like that other term I've heard. Terra nullius?
Close. Terra nullius means land belonging to no one. In Australia, it was used as a legal fiction to treat land as though it had no legally recognized owners, an idea Australia's High Court later rejected in 1992.
The US move was different, but just as effective. It didn't say the land was empty. It said the ultimate title was already spoken for, and indigenous nations could be pushed aside inside that framework.
And we have to watch the flip side too, the noble savage. The romantic idea that indigenous people were pure, simple children of nature.
Right. Whether you call someone bloodthirsty or noble, you're still shrinking them into a stereotype, something less than a real civilization with law, governance, and political strategy.
So what was the reality? If we strip away the savage label, what was actually there?
Complexity. Massive scale. Look at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi.
Around 1050 to 1100, Cahokia surged into one of the largest urban centers north of Mesoamerica. Population estimates vary widely, but even conservative numbers put it in the tens of thousands, on a scale that could rival major European cities of the era.
Or look at Chaco Canyon in the southwest. Great houses with hundreds of rooms and engineered roads stretching across the landscape.
And they had law and diplomacy. The Haudenosaunee used wampum belts to carry and preserve agreements, tools of governance and treaty-making, not decoration.
But you can't discover a world full of cities, alliances, and legal systems. So the story had to shrink those nations into savages to make erasure sound like order.
It feels like a story from the past, though. Does this legal language still matter?
It matters right now. The Supreme Court was still invoking the doctrine of discovery in modern cases as recently as 2005, sometimes tucked into a footnote, but still there, and the cracks are forming. In a March 30, 2023 statement, the Vatican explicitly repudiated the ideas now called the doctrine of discovery, even while acknowledging the historical damage. And on the ground, museums are changing fast, closing or covering displays and accelerating returns as tribal consultation and repatriation requirements tighten. The construct is being taken apart, piece by piece. We need to puncture the biggest myth of all. The cowboy didn't conquer the West.
Wait, so on that timeline, the whole Cowboy era is just that tiny sliver at the end?
Yes, the classic long drive open range boom is mostly late 1860s through the mid-1880s. Decades, not centuries. By then, the big engines of conquest were policy, railroads, settlers, and the US Army. The cowboy is a wage worker moving beef to railheads, not the person winning the frontier.
And if you look closely at the people doing that work, it doesn't match the movies. A lot of the techniques and the ranching culture itself came north from Mexican vaqueros. Even the vocabulary gives it away. Watch the words on screen. Lariat traces to Spanish la reata, chaps from chaparreras, and buckaroo is widely understood as an English reshaping of vaquero.
And it wasn't just one influence. It was a multiracial workforce. Depending on where and when you look, a commonly cited estimate is that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys on the trail were black. Many were formerly enslaved men, or the children of people who'd been enslaved, taking dangerous, underpaid work that at least offered wages and a shot at moving on.
1 in 4? That's nowhere in the westerns I grew up with. So why is the image so whitewashed?
Because the myth got manufactured early, first in dime novels and stage melodramas, then in Wild West shows in the 1880s, and finally in early film. Those stories flattened a business into a morality play. The lone white hero taming a supposedly empty, savage land. It sold tickets, but it erased multiracial labor, and it blurred the reality of native displacement.
And the reality ended faster than the legend. Open-range ranching was fragile. Barbed wire, market pressures, drought, and overgrazing all mattered. And then weather finished the job. The winter of 1886 to 87, the Great Die-Up, was catastrophic. In some places, herds lost half their cattle, and some outfits lost far more. That blizzard and fence image is basically the business model collapsing.
So the wire goes up, the money consolidates, and the cowboy becomes a wage worker on a fenced ranch.
Exactly. The Wild West is a short boom and bust window, open access, loose enforcement, hard margins, followed by consolidation. A lot of outfits went under, and the job became steadier and smaller.
But the myth was too useful to retire. It let America remember expansion as a clean, heroic adventure, while the real map, the real policies, and the real human costs stayed off-screen.
That's a heavy reality check. We went looking for heroes and villains, and found systems, economics, and a lot of grey. Thank you both for guiding us through the middle ground. It's not the story we learned in school, but it's the one we need to know.